welcome. As always, please comment down below where you are listening from, and don't forget to like the video. Let's get to it. Imagine walking to your car after buying groceries and never making it home. That's exactly what happened on October 2nd, 2002, when a single gunshot ended an unsuspecting man's life in a Maryland parking lot. Within hours, more victims would follow, each killed in ordinary locations: pumping gas, mowing a lawn, shopping. No one saw the killer. No one heard them coming. People realized it could happen to anyone, anywhere. But who was behind it? And how could they vanish so completely after each shot? A man stepped out of a convenience store in Wheaton, Maryland, just after sundown on October 2nd, 2002. He carried a bag of groceries, walked across the dimly lit parking lot, and before he could reach his car, he collapsed. One gunshot. No warning, no argument, just a sharp crack, followed by silence. People inside the store heard nothing unusual. There was no fight, no robbery attempt, no visible shooter waiting nearby. The man was gone, and no one could explain what had just happened. Why here, and why now? That was the question hanging over a neighborhood that had never seen anything like it. The parking lot where this first killing took place sat in a busy stretch of Wheaton. It was ordinary, the type of place where people came and went quickly, not a place linked to danger. At the time, Wheaton was a typical suburb outside Washington, D.C., with strip malls, small shops, and restaurants lined up along wide streets. To see a man shot dead in such a casual setting was shocking, not just for how sudden it was, but for how little made sense about it. He was not in a fight. He was not robbed. He had been coming from routine shopping. And then, in seconds, life ended. The randomness of it unsettled people immediately. When police arrived, they faced a crime scene stripped of the usual clues. No one saw anyone running away. No one heard multiple gunshots. Nothing looked like the gang disputes or stick-ups the department had worked before. Investigators leaned over the body and the ground around it, but there was nothing obvious to grasp onto. This was not a crime with a motive that shouted itself out. Officers had to ask if the man had been targeted personally, or if he had suffered because someone else wanted to kill whoever happened to be around. That uncertainty planted an unease that grew quickly. This shooting stood apart from the usual pattern of city crime. Normally, when someone was murdered in the street, there were links: a robbery, a personal feud, someone seen fleeing. Here there was nothing like that. The parking lot stayed empty except for the man's body. It was not just the silence that made this different, but the cold precision of one bullet, and then nothing else. Police radioed their reports, patrols fanned out, but in the end, they had nothing more than a victim who should have been safe, finishing a short errand. The effect on the neighborhood was immediate. People who had been nearby, or who heard afterward, started talking about how vulnerable it made them feel. Standing in front of a store, holding bags of food, should not leave you at risk. Parents began to think about their children walking through parking lots at night. Workers heading home later than usual wondered if staying outside those extra 5 minutes could cost them everything. The murder was not only tragic, it rewrote the sense of what was safe in Wheaton within one evening. What no one in Wheaton knew yet was that this was only the beginning. Within hours, more people would be shot in other places across nearby suburbs. The single death in the Wheaton parking lot revealed a violence that was not finished. Police struggled with the question of linkages. Was this man chosen because of something specific? Would they uncover a connection between him and his killer in a job, a relationship, or a conflict? Or had the bullet landed in his chest for no reason other than being visible at that moment? The lack of a clear tie made officers uneasy because random killings were the hardest to investigate. They left no trail that could be followed. Across suburban Maryland, families digested the news that a man had been killed so casually. The newspapers and local broadcasts treated it like a crime of interest, but not yet a crisis. Still, the tone was different than a standard police blotter item. The uncertainty stood out. And that uncertainty carried into conversations where neighbors asked one another how something like that could happen close to home. If it was a targeted act, they might have felt safer. If it was random, anyone could be next. That fear began to spread even before the next shootings came. Compared to ordinary criminal cases, the Wheaton killing had an eerie efficiency. There were no demands shouted at the victim, no struggle, no messy aftermath. It was one calculated strike, executed so quietly that it seemed less like a traditional killing and more like a controlled action designed to terrify. Sniper fire, even when directed at a single person, brought different rules. The ability to kill from a distance, unseen and unheard, took away the thin sense of control most people believed they had over their own safety. With snipers, No amount of awareness in your surroundings could save you. The question pressing in by the end of that night was what, if anything, linked the murdered man to others. If he had been targeted, detectives would try to map his life backward. If not, then the attack represented something far worse. The opening move in a game organized by someone who wanted to strike the public itself. Those were the possibilities. And each direction meant months of work ahead. In hindsight, this killing was exactly that, an opening. It was not about the victim personally, or about stealing money, or evening a score. It was a shot designed to announce the arrival of killers who had planned something larger. The man who had stepped into the Wheaton parking lot happened to become their first chosen image of randomness turned into terror. He was the first to fall in a sequence that spread across the DC suburbs, tightening its grip over ordinary life until no one knew how to feel safe. The following day would turn the anxiety into panic. What started with one body in a parking lot would spill into a trail of attacks, spread through schools, sidewalks, and gas stations. October 3rd would become a date stamped into memory for the sheer pace of deaths piling up across Maryland. No one in Wheaton went to bed that night understanding what lay ahead, but the sound of that single shot had already opened something that would not close for another 3 weeks. The next morning, across neighborhoods just a few miles apart, more lives would end in rapid succession, and the region would realize it was under siege. Within just one day, the region experienced a chain of shootings that shocked both residents and law enforcement. On October 3rd, 5 people were murdered in separate locations, all within a short drive of one another. Each killing happened during everyday routines, filling up at a gas station, crossing a parking lot, or walking along a sidewalk. The speed, the randomness, and the lack of witnesses created panic almost instantly. 10 hours was all it took for suburban Maryland to go from unsettled after one strange murder to realizing that someone was targeting strangers across the map. The day began with a man cutting grass outside a car dealership in Montgomery County. He was going about his job, moving in clear view of passing traffic. In an instant he fell, shot once. People nearby rushed to him, unsure of what had just happened. There was no car speeding away, no fight. He had been visible, and then he was gone. Only a single shot had been fired. It was early in the morning, but within minutes, word of the killing began to spread to those driving to work or dropping children off at school. Not long after, another shooting was reported only a few miles away. This time the victim was at a gas station, standing by his car with the pump in his hand. The same pattern followed. No confrontation. One gunshot, then confusion. Customers at the station froze in place, realizing that the shot could have come from anywhere. The idea of filling your tank, something people did almost every day, suddenly felt hazardous. The randomness was again on display. He had not been robbed, nothing was taken, and no one had seen a suspect. It appeared to be the same kind of attack as the earlier one. By the time police were still processing the first scenes, another call came in. A woman was gunned down in a parking lot while sitting in her car. That made 3 separate killings in different areas before lunchtime. Investigators began to see an emerging pattern. The victims were each killed in public, in ordinary suburban settings, struck before they could react. By mid-morning, they knew they were dealing with something far more serious than an isolated crime. The quick succession made it impossible to treat them as separate cases. Residents watching the news that morning grew tense. People driving to work passed police tape at one location, only to hear about another shooting miles away. The area was not huge, but the crimes were scattered across it, always close to major highways. That raised the unsettling idea that the killer, or killers, were on the move. Within hours, conversation on radio and TV turned toward the possibility of a mobile attacker picking new targets at random. Officers on duty had little chance to recover evidence before being pulled toward the next crime scene. The 4th shooting locked this fear in place. A woman was struck on a sidewalk near a post office. She was running errands, not involved in anything risky. By then, news outlets began hourly updates, warning people to stay alert. The fear spiraled quickly because no one could say where the next strike would land. Parents worried about walking into stores. People kept an eye on open spaces while doing the most ordinary tasks. It felt like nowhere was safe. Later that afternoon, a 5th killing happened. Again, at a gas station. A man stood exposed as he leaned over his car. The sound of a shot cut through the routine of pumping fuel, and witnesses described the same confusion as the earlier scenes. A victim down, no sign of who had fired. No suspect running away. All the murders looked almost identical in their execution. The day ended with 5 bodies and no leads except that the attacker could fire, vanish, and reappear somewhere else entirely. The geography mattered. Each attack was close enough to the others to alarm people who drove between towns every day. Commuters recognized those same stations and sidewalks, realizing they could have easily been in those spots. Police began comparing times and distances. They saw that each shooting was within a short drive, suggesting a shooter with access to a car. It was not someone hiding on foot, slipping away into backyards. It looked like someone rolling through suburban streets, choosing victims, and driving off before law enforcement could close in. By night, the seriousness of the situation became clear across all levels of police. At first, they wondered whether the spree was a flare-up of gang violence, but the victims were strangers, and nothing was taken. Others raised the possibility of acts tied to terrorism, considering how unusual the method seemed. Still others suspected a lone gunman with sniper skills. Each theory had problems. A terrorist plot usually announced itself with a message or included multiple actors. A lone wolf could account for some elements, but not the speed of travel between attacks. At the time, uncertainty was feeding the fear as much as the killings themselves. Law enforcement agencies ramped up their presence, marked patrol cars, filled gas stations to give people cover while fueling. Helicopters scanned highways. Checkpoints slowed traffic in an effort to trap the shooter before they disappeared again. The investigation grew in scale within a single day because authorities knew more attacks could happen at any moment. While the shootings shocked the public with their pace, the way they were carried out also created enormous frustration for investigators. Witnesses never saw the shooter. Some only heard the sharp crack of a gunshot and then saw someone drop. In a few cases, people reported hearing nothing at all, only realizing what had happened by the reaction of others around them. No description could be pieced together, and that meant police could not release any warning beyond telling people to be on guard. The question spread quickly. How could someone kill this many people in separate locations so quickly without ever being spotted? The answer, though still unknown to officers that day, was simple. The shooter or shooters were not on foot. They were operating from a vehicle that gave them the ability to strike from a distance, fire a single round, and slip away. A modified car, equipped in a way no one suspected, made it possible to murder strangers from seemingly nowhere. That sedan would roll up to locations like any family car, wait for the right moment, and then drive off without raising suspicion. In one day, that tactic allowed 5 people in 5 locations to be gunned down without anyone knowing who to look for. It was one of the most effective ways to evade capture because authorities had no face, no weapon recovered, and no clear escape path to follow. Even after that devastating set of attacks, investigators still sat at their desks and in their briefing rooms without any names or descriptions to work with. They had a sense of mobility, an impression of precision, and a growing fear that the shooter could appear anywhere next. Suburban Washington, D.C. had become a hunting ground, and the person behind it was still invisible. Word of the day's events traveled far beyond Maryland by nightfall. Families in Virginia and the district followed the coverage, realizing the spree was not limited to one corner of the region. The cluster of killings revealed a threat that could shift to any surrounding community. The sense of safety had fractured completely, and police now faced a task unlike any they had seen before. Even though they had mobilized in full force, the truth was that they had no idea who the killers were or what they looked like. How safe is it to pump gas or mow your lawn? In October of 2002, the answer was clear. Not safe at all. For weeks, across the Washington, D.C. suburbs, routine activities that people had never second-guessed became the stages for sudden death. Stopping to buy groceries, carrying school supplies, sitting outside on a bench. All of it now carried an edge of dread. It was a time when each trip outside forced a choice: do the errand or risk becoming the next name on the evening news. The transformation of daily life came fast. In the first days of the shootings, gas stations grew especially tense. The wide-open areas around the pumps gave drivers no cover and no way to hide. People bent down beside their cars, using metal doors as shields between themselves and the open air. Others chose to crouch while fueling, moving quickly but never letting their bodies stay exposed. Some stations in Montgomery County erected makeshift tarps or hung tarpaulins to block sightlines from roadways, hoping it might give customers some sense of control. These were not official safety measures. They were desperate acts that reflected how unsettled people had become. Parents adjusted their routines too. Many schools across Maryland and Virginia changed the way children arrived and left each day. Outdoor recess was cancelled. Students were kept indoors, and teachers led them to buses in organized lines to avoid clusters where shots could be fired. The sense of threat for children ran deeper than for adults because of one chilling event. A 13-year-old boy was shot and seriously wounded outside his middle school in Prince George's County. He had been walking toward the building, book bag slung behind him, when a bullet tore into him. He survived, but the attack reverberated across the region, sparking panic in families who thought children might be shielded from risk. Suddenly, even schools, considered safe ground, no longer felt secure. What made it even worse was the absence of any clear profile. Victims included men and women, young and old, people from different races and backgrounds. No type of person was singled out. The only thing connecting them was that they were in the open, performing some normal task in public. That level of unpredictability meant people could not reassure themselves that they were safe. Going outside for a moment was enough. Individuals leaned toward the idea that the shooter wanted no specific person, but rather anyone who appeared available at a given moment. The psychological effect soon rivaled the physical toll. In interviews at the time, residents admitted to zigzagging across parking lots, weaving their path, as if that might make them harder targets. Drivers scanned overpasses before pulling underneath, suspecting a hidden shooter could be waiting above. Simple habits, like walking across a street or standing in line for food, were infused with tension. The entire suburban landscape became suspect, because any place where a person spent even a few seconds outdoors could be lethal. Media coverage amplified those fears. Daily press briefings detailed the rising count of deaths and injuries. Local outlets broadcast reminders from police to stay alert, and national news gravitated toward the horrifying scenario of children being in danger. The phrase repeated often was that children are not safe anywhere. That sentence circulated among parents, echoed in headlines and talk shows, until it lodged as an unavoidable truth in people's minds. Many families responded by keeping their children at home, skipping trips to playgrounds, malls, or even birthday parties. It was not paranoia. It was an attempt to erase any avoidable exposure. The string of shootings had changed the very meaning of public space. Spaces once meant for community, like parks, sidewalks, or fields, suddenly felt untrustworthy. Private property lines offered no real reassurance because one victim had fallen while mowing his yard. The attacks had erased the boundary between safe and unsafe space. Someone could be at work, in school, or even just outside their own house, and it made no difference. The killers had achieved a chilling effect, convincing thousands of people that nowhere was beyond reach. Why target such ordinary acts? One explanation investigators began to consider was that the shooters were trying to maximize fear, not just body counts. By selecting routine activities that touched everyone's life, they were spreading panic deeper than any one crime could. Firing on someone in a dispute would have seemed local, contained, and limited, but firing at strangers chosen by circumstance forced entire communities to adapt and change daily life. Fear was no longer abstract. It was written into the way people filled their tanks or guided their children across sidewalks. The situation left law enforcement battling not only the killers, but the climate of anxiety. Police officers parked their cruisers in front of some stations to shield customers. Helicopters droned overhead along major highways in hopes of spotting suspicious vehicles. Uniformed personnel became fixtures near malls and schools. Despite these visible precautions, residents had no sense that they were truly protected. All it took was another crack of a rifle at any place, at any time, to show how little distance those measures really offered. The wounded boy at the middle school highlighted just how far the trauma had spread. Parents bonded over fear in the days afterward, sharing anxious phone calls and refusing to let children walk alone. Teachers found themselves leading classrooms heavy with unease, telling kids to stay away from windows. Even young students grasped what was happening in a rough outline. They knew someone outside was shooting innocents. They understood that any step outdoors could be dangerous. Communities with little exposure to violent crime, before that autumn now wrestled with collective dread. The killers had created something larger than a series of murders. They had warped the rhythm of normal life. Each public act came with calculation. How fast could it be done? How exposed would a person be while doing it? And was there shelter nearby? The span of 3 weeks reshaped the geography of trust across Maryland and Virginia. Every open space looked like a trap. Every pause in movement felt unsafe. In hindsight, it became clear that the choice of targets was about more than logistics. While some spots offered clear sightlines for a sniper, the recurring emphasis on fuel stations, sidewalks, and school grounds suggested intent to weaponize daily life itself. The shooters exploited habits everyone shared. The horror lay not in a complex plan, but in its simplicity, killing in plain sight while never revealing themselves. Each act drove home the message that survival depended less on awareness and more on pure luck. That was the answer to why pumping gas or mowing your lawn became deadly. It was because the snipers chose to use routine behaviors as their weapon. The invisibility of their attack amplified that fear, because the victims could not be blamed for risk-taking or reckless acts. They had merely participated in ordinary life, and that made their deaths echo further, salting dread into every corner of the region. But the psychological power of the killings was only half the story. What allowed this invisible threat to sustain itself for weeks was not just strategy, but the hidden mechanics behind it. Police began to suspect that the attackers' mobility was not incidental, but central to their method. The key was the weapon, and more importantly, the way it had been paired with a vehicle, turning something as familiar as a family sedan into a disguised instrument of death. Investigators didn't know it yet, but the killers had turned an ordinary family sedan into something much more dangerous. The vehicle was a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, a model that blended into traffic and raised no suspicion. At first glance, it was nothing more than an aging car rolling through Maryland and Virginia highways. What the police would eventually learn was that it had been changed into a weapon, a place where the shooters could remain hidden while targeting strangers. It became a rolling sniper's nest, and it allowed them to stay close enough to the community to disappear in plain sight. The Caprice's exterior told no story. It was not marked, it was not stolen, and it did not draw attention. Older sedans were common on suburban streets, parked outside shopping centres, or lined up in rows at apartment buildings. No one would look twice at it when it idled near a gas station or pulled off onto the shoulder of a road. This was part of the killer's strategy. They didn't need camouflage when the car itself was ordinary enough to blend with thousands of others across the Washington region. Inside, however, it was far from normal. The back seat of the Caprice had been removed. This allowed the shooters to use the trunk as a concealed firing position. A hole had been cut near the license plate, small enough that it did not stand out to anyone who wasn't inspecting the car closely. Through this opening, the barrel of a rifle could be pushed outward, steady, and aimed at anyone in sight. From behind, to a casual observer, the car looked whole. Parked among other vehicles, no sign revealed that it was a weapon waiting to fire. That engineering decision proved decisive. By staying inside the car, the shooters avoided exposing themselves. Onlookers never saw a man carrying a rifle, never spotted someone perched on an overpass, never caught a figure running away. The shot came, and the car simply rolled away, indistinguishable from all the others crossing the roads at the same time. To law enforcement, that absence of an identifiable human presence was maddening. Each time investigators arrived at a murder scene, they heard the same accounts: a loud crack, sudden collapse, and then stillness. Nothing else. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Inside the trunk, the setup was organized for precision. The Bushmaster, 223 caliber rifle, lay ready to fire. Alongside it were maps marking locations, notes from past surveillance, and walkie-talkies for communication. Each piece had a purpose. The walkie-talkies helped the pair coordinate while moving. The maps pinpointed streets and lot layouts that offered clear sightlines. Even the trunk hole, though crude in shape, gave them the chance to shoot without giving onlookers the view of a man aiming through a window. Anyone who might have stood 15 feet away still saw nothing more than a car. The car was also their escape tool. Every sniper attack relied on getting away before law enforcement could block off routes. By staging attacks directly from the Caprice, there was no need to ditch weapons or flee across neighborhoods. They fired, closed up the trunk, and drove off within seconds. In heavy suburban traffic, the blue sedan merged into the background. Witnesses at gas stations often remembered nothing notable, only that cars were coming and going as usual. Nothing about a Chevrolet Caprice parked nearby would make them recall it later. Investigators were left with little to study. Without witnesses describing suspects, composite sketches were impossible. The crime scenes yielded shell casings but no usable fingerprints or DNA. The attacker's distance to the victims added further difficulty. Because the shot came from dozens of feet away, no one could connect it directly to any one position. The idea of a vehicle being used in this way was not immediately central in their thinking. Law enforcement at first wondered about a gunman hiding in the woods or perched on rooftops. It would take time before they began suspecting that an ordinary car could be the staging point for each murder. That suspicion came later, when the absence of other explanations forced investigators to expand their theories. No one saw shadows moving across roofs. Patrol sweeps of wooded areas came back empty. Each strike happened near roads and parking lots. That detail stood out. How often the settings were spots where vehicles could sit unnoticed. Gradually, profiles shifted toward the possibility of a mobile shooter. If the killings were tied together, only a vehicle could explain the speed of movement and the invisibility of the suspect. They were right, but confirming it was not simple. The Caprice's disguises extended even to its registration. John Muhammad had made sure the vehicle did not carry details that drew attention. It looked like any second-hand car owned by a working man. When police began canvassing for vehicles spotted near scenes, dozens of witnesses only provided general categories such as sedans, station wagons, or white vans. One recurring thread was a white box truck, spotted in the area of several murders. That incorrect lead consumed time and resources, while the real killer car continued to drive unremarked. The blue Caprice passed through police checkpoints more than once without its secret being uncovered. Meanwhile, forensics teams faced pressure. They sifted through each site with expectations of breakthrough evidence, but the best they could pull were single bullets that told them caliber, not identity. A Bushmaster rifle could be traced if located, but without it, the bullets were just metal. The lack of any human description made investigators restless. It wasn't that people were refusing to cooperate. Simply put, anyone close enough to see the killer would have been the victim, and those far enough away saw only ordinary traffic. Still, the very cleverness of such a system raised the question of sustainability. The shooters could kill and escape again and again from this vehicle, but could they do it forever? Patterns tend to form, and mistakes tend to follow long campaigns. Investigators worried and waited, knowing that while the car kept them safe, the killers might slip up in other ways. A missed detail, a trace left behind, or a witness catching sight of the wrong thing could shift the balance. The Caprice was a strong disguise, but it depended on continued luck. In the end, what was inside the blue Caprice was nothing less than a mobile kill zone camouflaged as an aging family car. In the trunk sat the rifle that had ended lives at gas stations and sidewalks. On its floor were maps covered in notations, walkie-talkies used for communication, and traces that tied back to the killers. From the outside it offered no clue, but from within, it was a hidden firing post that had carried out weeks of murders unseen. Even with such an effective setup, the killers were not infallible. The vehicle bought them time, but it did not make them untouchable. As investigators cast wider nets and began piecing together clues, the careful disguise of the sedan could not protect them from human error. Mistakes outside the car would soon provide the openings that the vehicle itself refused to give. At one of the crime scenes, police came across something they had not seen before in the sniper attacks. There was a message left behind, written carefully, folded, and placed where investigators would be sure to find it. After weeks of unanswered questions, this was the first direct contact from the killers themselves. It set off alarms not only because it broke the silence, but because it raised the possibility that the shooters wanted more than just bloodshed. A note meant communication. Communication meant motive, and motive could be used to draw them out. The contents startled investigators. The shooters demanded money in exchange for stopping the murders. There were threats of more deaths if their instructions were not followed, along with words that hinted at a deliberate plan. The letter called for hundreds of thousands of dollars to be transferred in a way that would be difficult to trace. It wasn't messy or spontaneous, it looked composed. This suggested to detectives and FBI profilers that the snipers weren't just venting rage or acting on impulse. They were acting with intent, and their intent included recognition and control over the course of events. But the bigger problem for police was whether to treat the letter as real. In previous cases of mass shootings or serial killings, false confessions and fake messages had been planted to waste investigators' time. Was this letter genuine, or was it a decoy from someone looking to mislead? Law enforcement analyzed the handwriting, the phrasing, even the paper itself. A wrong call could divide resources. If they assumed it was false and ignored it, they might miss a lead. If they assumed it was real and it wasn't, they could be chasing ghosts. The careful tone of the letter pushed many to believe this was indeed from the shooters. One detail made investigators lean toward authenticity. The note mentioned earlier shootings in other states. These were incidents from Alabama and other locations months before, unsolved gun crimes that hadn't been officially linked to anything in Maryland. It wasn't public knowledge that those crimes shared characteristics, making it unlikely that a copycat would know to reference them. That connection showed planning and hinted at a longer spree than people realized. The killers had been testing out their tactics before bringing their methods to Washington. Now they were laying claim to a string of violence across state lines. The implications unsettled law enforcement leadership. If the same shooters had already struck in other states, then October of 2002 was not the beginning. It was the middle of a campaign. Investigators had to go back and re-examine open homicides that looked similar, reaching out to local police departments to exchange ballistics data. Suddenly, The case wasn't bound inside suburban Maryland and Virginia. It stretched from coast to coast. It revealed not just killers at large, but organized offenders who wanted their actions noticed, even credited to them directly. The content of the letter also revealed something about the psychology behind the crimes. Many mass killers thrive on notoriety, seeing themselves as actors in a story that should be told after each attack. But this letter tied notoriety to leverage. The snipers weren't just saying, "Look at us." They were saying, "Pay us, and we stop." That approach had echoes of extortion cases where criminals used violence or its threat to draw cash out of institutions. In history, messages from kidnappers, extortionists, and bombers had contained a similar structure: demands for large sums, a promise to stop if obeyed, and a threat of more deaths if ignored. Investigators brought in behavioral experts to study the wording. They noted that the message lacked wild or erratic language. It wasn't filled with insults or emotional outbursts. It was measured, even clinical. That helped reinforce the idea that the killers were not acting out of short-term fury. Instead, they were following a sequence: preparation, attack, intimidation, and negotiation. This calm level of control made them much harder to predict. It also meant that investigators couldn't rely on them to make easy mistakes born of anger. For behavioral profilers, the note was gold. It gave them material to dissect language, to work out possible education levels, geographic patterns, and cultural backgrounds. Every choice of word became data. Was the grammar correct? Was the handwriting steady? Did the letter refer to the victims in personal terms or distant terms? These subtle clues helped narrow the field of likely suspects, even if only by degrees. At the same time, investigators had to be careful about releasing too much to the public. Broadcasting sections of the letter could spark false leads, with people phoning in, claiming to recognize handwriting or style. The timing of the note's arrival was also a point of discussion. It came after several weeks of killings and widespread fear, just when law enforcement was struggling under pressure. That timing suggested the killers were watching the police response, adjusting to it, and then inserting themselves into the investigation. Police didn't like being pulled around by those committing the crimes, but they couldn't ignore the letter either. Doing so risked more attacks without the chance for negotiation. The letter left at the scene changed the framework of the investigation. What had seemed only like a spree killing, a shocking, bloody run with no guiding purpose, suddenly had structure. The structure included money, references to earlier murders, and a voice that revealed intelligence and control. The shooters had shown their hand, at least partially, and in doing so gave profilers more direction. Instead of chasing only physical evidence, investigators now had a psychological window to work with. The lesson from crime history is that communication often marks a turning point. Famous extortion notes and ransom letters in previous decades sometimes cracked cases because of paper, phrasing, or fingerprints. Others only deepened the mystery. With the Beltway Snipers letter, authorities faced both sides. On the one hand, they had links to older crimes and a motive to exploit. On the other hand, they had to proceed quietly, because making a mistake with such offenders could cost more lives. They could not treat the killers like pranksters or adolescents playing games. The killings had already proved the seriousness. Investigators wondered if the letter would help them connect names and faces. The references to other crimes pushed them to review case files far from Washington. The money demand pointed toward a need, whether practical or symbolic. Pinning down which one it was could break open the killer's background. These were not questions they could answer yet, but the presence of the note gave them a new direction to explore. What was the true message the snipers left that helped investigators connect the dots? It was more than just a demand for cash. It was proof the same pair had been active before Maryland. It was the first direct link that joined scattered shootings under a single identity. And it revealed that these were not crimes fueled by sudden anger. They were planned, executed, and tied together by killers who wanted both recognition and reward. Even with the letter studied and catalogued, officers still lacked a face to attach to the crimes. The car remained hidden. The rifle had not been found. But soon, the killers made another move that gave police a hard piece of evidence to hold onto: a fingerprint. And with that, for the first time, names began to enter the investigation. The death of Linda Franklin did not just add one more victim to the tally. It changed the weight of the entire case. Franklin was a 47-year-old FBI analyst who had worked for years in counterterrorism. On the evening of October 14th, 2002, she was leaving a Home Depot store in Fairfax County, Virginia, with her husband. After shopping, Franklin carried bags to her car and began loading them into the trunk. It was an ordinary suburban errand on a Monday night. In seconds, it turned into one of the most pivotal moments of the Beltway Sniper investigation. A single round tore into her. She collapsed, killed instantly in front of her husband and other bystanders. Franklin's murder carried a symbolic weight from the beginning. Unlike earlier victims, who represented teachers, tradespeople, or retirees, Franklin was a federal employee tied to the very agency leading the national response to terrorism. The killers had no idea who she was, but the fact that she worked for the FBI was not lost on anyone. It signaled that no segment of society was off limits. If an analyst for federal law enforcement could be gunned down while doing chores at a hardware store, then absolutely no one was immune. The randomness of her killing matched the sniper's method, but the identity of the victim gave the event an added layer of intensity. It pierced into the law enforcement community itself. Franklin was not a field agent, but to her colleagues she was family. Federal agents in Washington knew her, and word of her death spread across the bureau faster than any other detail from the spree. For FBI personnel already under immense strain from post-September 11th work, the shock was intense. Agents who were already putting in long nights on the sniper task force now felt one of their own had been taken. This intensified morale, but also multiplied public and political pressure. When news broke that an FBI analyst had become the next sniper victim, national news outlets seized on the story. Coverage that had already been heavy now shifted into near-constant reports. Franklin's death was picked up by every major television network. Newspapers laid out headlines that tied the sniper crisis directly to federal institutions. It became less of a regional tragedy and more of a national emergency in the public eye. The location of the shooting added to the unease. The Home Depot was surrounded by rows of shops and parking spaces in Fairfax County, one of the most suburban stretches of Northern Virginia. Families spent evenings there, stocking up on supplies. Watching police cordon off the store while Franklin's body lay nearby intensified fears about safety in yet another type of space. It wasn't just gas stations or schoolyards anymore. Even shopping centers were revealed as vulnerable sites. For residents, this meant there was truly no distinction left about which daily activities could put them at risk. At FBI headquarters, the mood shifted sharply. The investigation had already been elevated to major case standards, but now Franklin's colleagues participated with added urgency. Every task force meeting, from Montgomery County's local command posts to the FBI's own conference rooms, now carried the burden of her loss. The idea that someone connected to the government had been murdered while agencies searched for the killers fueled new levels of determination. For many within federal law enforcement, this stopped being a case to close and became a personal fight. From that point, coordination grew. There had already been a daily rhythm of press briefings, where officials released new information to the public. After Franklin's killing, those briefings expanded in size and importance. Multiple agencies appeared together on camera. Senior officials, not just local commanders, spoke directly to the nation. This reflected how the case had transformed into a matter of top national concern. The governor of Maryland, the governor of Virginia, and federal officials collected at podiums together. The hunt for the snipers was no longer treated as a regional manhunt. It was framed as a crisis for the country's capital region, and by extension, the country as a whole. Law enforcement morale came under strain even as urgency rose. Agents and officers had already dealt with weeks of fruitless searches. Now, with one of their own killed, emotions played a larger role. For the FBI, there was the added weight of public expectation. The Bureau could not allow killers to remain at large after one of its analysts had become a victim. Pressure from the White House and Congress followed, with questions raised about why so few solid leads had emerged weeks into the spree. Linda Franklin's murder reinforced the sense of unpredictability. She was not chosen for who she was, but her death emphasized the point the snipers had been making all along. Anyone could be next. For the public, that realization deepened fear. For police, it forced a recalibration. If even a Home Depot in Fairfax, lit, populated, right off major highways, could become the next target, then surveillance and patrol had to stretch even further. The manhunt sprawled into one of the broadest mobilizations of local, state, and federal manpower seen in years. At the same time, the killing highlighted the one question investigators kept asking themselves. Would this particular death give them the push needed to finally hunt down the suspects? Cases often shift momentum when a victim ties directly to high-ranking circles. Franklin's position inside the FBI meant her colleagues would not stop until justice was secure. But motive and determination alone were not enough. Detectives needed evidence, leads, and someone to connect the gunfire to real identities. The link between this murder and its wider impact can be measured in scale. Before Franklin's death, Residents across Maryland and Virginia were already tense, but agencies were still coordinating at the county and state level. Afterward, the case expanded swiftly into what looked and felt like wartime response. Intelligence sharing became more structured, federal analysts boosted resources, public updates multiplied. Franklin became not just the 10th victim, but the pivot that elevated the sniper manhunt to absolute top priority across every available channel. That is why the death of Linda Franklin mattered so deeply in the sequence of events. It transformed the emotional stakes for law enforcement, expanded the scale of national media attention, and triggered federal institutions to commit everything they had. It did not accelerate the killer's timetable, but it accelerated the government's pursuit. From that moment, the case became impossible to treat as anything less than a national frontline problem. The impact of her death remained visible weeks later, as new strategies were employed. Yet even with all that momentum, investigators were still chasing shadows. The car was unidentified, the rifle had not been located. Descriptions of suspects were non-existent. Franklin's case gave them urgency, but not proof. The next stage would come only when the killers themselves loosened their grip on secrecy. And soon, that would happen, not through federal force, but because of a small mistake. That error would finally put names to the shadows the country had feared for over 3 weeks. For weeks, the snipers seemed to vanish after every killing. Crime scenes yielded little more than shell casings. Police searches ended without suspects, and the region lived under constant fear, with no clear image of who was responsible. That silence, however, ended not in Maryland or Virginia, but in Alabama. In early October, a liquor store in Montgomery was targeted during a robbery. 2 people were shot, and evidence was left behind. The robbery had not looked like the sniper attacks at first. It was more chaotic and close-up than their usual strikes, but what surfaced inside that building gave investigators the first concrete proof of who they were hunting. At the scene of the robbery, police recovered fingerprints lifted from a magazine clip and other surfaces touched during the crime. The fingerprint evidence was processed through available databases using routine checks. What made this discovery crucial was the fact that the print matched an existing record. That record belonged to a teenager named Lee Boyd Malvo. Malvo had been arrested in Washington state months earlier on an unrelated matter, meaning his information and identity were on file. Without that prior contact with law enforcement, the recovered fingerprint might have joined thousands of unknowns. Instead, it lit up as a direct match. Investigators were suddenly staring at their first name tied to the snipers. Malvo was young, a Jamaican national who had moved through several states with his mother in recent years. Living in places ranging from Florida to Washington, he had been in the United States without secure immigration status, something that had crossed him with law enforcement in Seattle. That small brush with the system left behind the exact identifier police now needed. From weeks of having no suspects at all, detectives now had the name of an individual they could connect to, fresh evidence from Alabama. What this meant in practical terms was a mixture of relief and tension. Relief, because investigators finally had a thread they could pull. For more than 2 weeks, the lack of direction had been suffocating to officers on round-the-clock duty. But it also meant that the snipers were no longer abstract. They were people who could be found, who had histories, and who could make mistakes. The tension came from realizing that, while there was a name, there was still no face seen firing from a car. Still no one physically tied to the killings in Maryland and Virginia. It was a lead, but one that required careful work to bridge across state lines. While detectives looked closer at Malvo, FBI analysts began connecting him to a figure already familiar to them, John Allen Muhammad. Muhammad, a Gulf War veteran, had once lived in Tacoma, Washington, where he had crossed paths with Malvo. Neighbors would later recall the unusual closeness between them. But at the time, what stood out to investigators was Muhammad's background with firearms. A record showed he owned a Bushmaster .223 caliber rifle, the very type determined to have fired the sniper rounds in Maryland. The pieces began forming more than a name. They formed a pair. Police and federal agencies traced Muhammad's history carefully. He had military training and marksmanship experience, knowledge that matched the precision of the Beltway attacks. He also had reasons to move often, with a past that included a custody fight over his children and legal disputes that may have festered into resentment. With Malvo already highlighted by the fingerprint, Muhammad emerged as the older partner. FBI ballistics experts noted how the recovered bullets matched a Bushmaster rifle model known for its reliability and range. With that, Muhammad was more than just a name pulled from Malvo's orbit. He became the second half of the answer. The confirmation process unfolded quickly once both names surfaced. Maryland investigators could finally attach identities to case files that had previously been marked unknown shooter. With the names came photographs, immigration documents, and background contacts. Officers now knew what faces they were searching for and what connections might lead them closer to the killer's vehicle. The challenge remained to move from identity on paper to physical capture. Surveillance teams were told to track down both men across multiple states. For investigators who had spent weeks explaining failure at press briefings, this moment brought cautious optimism. They could not announce the names right away. Doing so risked alerting Mohammed and Malvo that authorities were closing in. Instead, they worked quietly to gather support, watch bus stations and highways, and link the two suspects to the elusive Chevrolet Caprice. Still, the discovery meant that every officer mobilized on the sniper case could change from random patrols to targeted searches. The invisible killer now had names, voices, and past addresses that could be tied to real locations. The critical question lingered: could this actually be the breakthrough they needed, or was it still not enough to close the case? Having identities on file did not mean immediate arrests. The snipers were still operating actively, people were still being shot, communities still crouched while pumping gas and kept their children indoors. But the fingerprint made it possible to believe the case would not end in unsolved terror. It was the first hard, indisputable link between the pattern of attacks and living suspects. The mistake that gave them away was small but decisive. Mohammed and Malvo had shifted from their sniper method to commit a close-contact crime. In doing so, they broke their own pattern of invisibility. Fingerprints left during the Montgomery robbery tied Malvo to an old juvenile record, and once his name emerged, federal investigators drew the line straight to Mohammed and the Bushmaster rifle. That slip removed the veil of anonymity that had protected them. It cracked open a case that once seemed unsolvable. As news moved quietly among investigators, separate strands began converging. Reports of vehicles that might be linked to the suspects, sightings of a blue sedan, and previous addresses all started to merge into a clearer picture. Task forces expanded collaboration, now operating with shared certainty about who they were hunting. The old Caprice, still anonymous to the public, was now on lists and in briefings as a potential killer's nest. Surveillance tightened around areas thought to be connected to Mohammed, while analysts looked for any trace Malvo might leave behind. The fingerprint was just one piece, but it was the first piece that carried weight strong enough to shift the investigation into a new phase. The snipers finally had names attached to them, and with that change, the chase moved from shadow to pursuit, leading investigators step by step closer to the car that had eluded them for weeks. Within days, those separate strands, fingerprints, ballistics, and sightings, would close in on a rest stop outside Maryland. The 23 days of fear were heading toward an end, and with it, the first real chance at relief for the Washington region. After 23 days of fear and unanswered questions, a tip from an alert citizen pointed officers to a highway rest stop in Maryland. The man making the call was a mechanic who had been listening closely to reports about the wanted Chevrolet Caprice. He thought he had spotted the same car parked along Interstate 70 near Myersville. The vehicle matched the description. Investigators had begun sharing more quietly among law enforcement, blue in color, an older model, and tied back to John Mohammed and Lee Boyd Malvo. The caller dialed 911 and reported what he had seen. His report moved quickly through channels until the decision was made to surround the rest area. By that night, police from multiple agencies had converged on the scene. The rest stop was cleared and quietly locked down by tactical teams. They sealed off exits and moved patrol units into place to block routes leading to and from the compound. Officers prepared as if approaching armed men who could open fire at any moment. Nobody knew exactly how the two suspects would react once they realized the police were closing in. With over a dozen attacks attributed to the pair, caution was at its highest level. What the officers found surprised them. Inside the Chevrolet Caprice, John Mohammed and Lee Malvo were asleep. They had parked the sedan alongside other vehicles in the lot and laid down for the night. Instead of witnessing chaos, officers were met with near silence. Tactical units moved in, weapons ready, surrounding the car. Step by step, they approached, keeping lights low to avoid startling the suspects before positions were secure. The men were removed from the vehicle without resistance. After weeks of death and panic across the region, the arrests themselves took only minutes. The fact that the capture was calm felt almost unreal to many of the officers involved. For weeks, the public had pictured faceless killers capable of striking anywhere, unstoppable and invisible. In reality, the men were tired, unaware, and caught in their sleep. Yet inside that vehicle was the evidence investigators had been waiting to find. Once the men were in custody, a full search of the Chevrolet Caprice began. Officers knew this was the moment when speculation and theory had to become proof. Whatever was inside the car needed to tie the suspects, not just to one shooting, but to all of them. The search produced exactly that. Hidden in the trunk, officers lifted the weapon most feared throughout the Washington suburbs, the Bushmaster 223 caliber rifle. It was there, positioned and ready, just as investigators had suspected after analyzing ballistics. The hole cut near the license plate was visible from the inside. From that slim opening, the shooters had aimed and fired without ever getting out of the car. The interior of the trunk showed adjustments that allowed each man to slide into firing position and remain invisible outside. This was the rolling sniper's nest that had baffled detectives for almost a month. Along with the rifle, officers discovered ammunition, maps marked with notes, walkie-talkies, and items linking the pair to previous shootings. Papers and equipment filled the trunk, leaving little doubt that the Caprice was not just transport, but headquarters for their attacks. The rifle itself was the most important item. Testing later confirmed it was the firearm that fired bullets recovered from victims in Maryland, Virginia, and the district. The long hunt for a face or a name had finally been resolved, with a weapon found in the suspect's possession. Investigators took time to document everything. They photographed the trunk, catalogued the ammunition, and secured the rifle. The visual evidence told the story clearly. The small cut hole in the car matched the theory long suspected, that the shooters had not been on rooftops or in wooded hills. They had been parked beside victims all along, blending into background traffic. The hidden nest explained why no one had seen a figure with a rifle. All witnesses ever saw were cars. Now, with the Caprice in custody, the mystery's machinery was revealed. News of the arrest spread quickly. Residents who had gone to sleep fearful woke to broadcasts reporting that 2 suspects had been captured alive. Relief settled over neighborhoods that had lived under both visible police presence and invisible threat. People filled gas stations again without crouching low beside their doors. Children returned to outdoor school activities gradually. The idea that routine acted as bait for murder began to drain away once people knew the men behind the attacks could no longer strike. For law enforcement, the mood also shifted. Weeks of frustration had ended with practical evidence. Every bullet recovered now had a weapon to attach to. Every map and note pulled from the trunk built a case for deliberate targeting and planning. The car told its own story. Investigators who had been dealing in maybes could now point to physical proof. They had not only suspects but connections that explained how they acted, what tools they used, and why they had succeeded in evading capture for so long. It is hard to understand just how large the relief was without remembering the scale of the fear. People had changed the way they fueled their cars, the way they walked outdoors, even the way schools managed playgrounds. That level of disruption to society had not come from natural disaster or accident. It had come from 2 men with a car and a rifle. When the car was finally opened and the Bushmaster removed, it was not just an item of evidence but a symbol that the reign of uncertainty was over. The critical discovery was that the Caprice contained everything the investigation needed. The Bushmaster rifle used in the shootings, the modified firing slot cut into the body of the car, and materials that tied John Muhammad and Lee Malvo directly to their weeks of violence. Those items closed the gap between suspicion and proof. In 23 days, suburban Washington had been transformed by fear. In one early morning arrest and a search of a single trunk, law enforcement had restored a measure of safety. The find tied every strand together. But it also raised new questions about how the crimes had unfolded, why they had been committed, and how justice would be pursued from state to state. The car and its contents marked the end of one stage, the hunt. What came next was the long process of trials, explanations, and reflection across communities, still asking themselves what it all meant. After the arrests, the central question shifted. Who were the men behind the shootings? And more importantly, why had they done it? For 3 weeks, the focus had been on survival and capture. With John Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo in custody, attention moved to the courtrooms. The public wanted justice, but officials also wanted answers. What drove a middle-aged military veteran and a teenager to turn a family sedan into a weapon against strangers across suburban Washington? The trials became not only a legal process, but a search for meaning in violence that had rattled millions and disrupted the rhythm of daily life. The legal journey began almost immediately after their capture. Both men faced capital charges in Virginia and Maryland, where most of the murders had occurred. Prosecutors focused on the strongest cases first, preparing for lengthy court proceedings that might take years. John Muhammad became the central defendant. At the time, he was 41, a former soldier trained in marksmanship, and described by prosecutors as the architect of the attacks. Jury selection alone took weeks, as potential jurors admitted their fear and memories from the fall of 2002. The evidence was laid out: the rifle, the blue Chevrolet Caprice, the ballistics results that matched bullets to the gun. In 2003, Muhammad was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Lee Malvo, just 17 during the shootings, became a different legal story. His age presented questions about how to handle his cases. Initially, prosecutors also sought the death penalty against him, arguing that his role had been active. But Malvo's defense pointed to his youth, his dependence on Muhammad, and claims of manipulation by an older authority figure. In trial after trial, the verdict came back as guilty, but judges sentenced Malvo to life imprisonment without parole rather than death. Over time, changing attitudes toward juvenile punishment reinforced that outcome. Years later, court challenges revisited whether someone under 18 could be sentenced to life without parole, leaving lingering legal complications in Malvo's status. As courtroom work unfolded, the deeper and unsettled debate centered on motive. Prosecutors discussed two interconnected stories. The first involved personal revenge. Muhammad was embroiled in a custody dispute with his ex-wife over their children. Some investigators believed he intended to use the chaos of sniper shootings to set the stage for killing her and regaining control of his family. Killing random strangers, they argued, would distract authorities and heighten fear, allowing him to mask his true objective. The second theory came directly from Malvo's testimony and later interviews. According to him, Muhammad talked of a multi-phase plan that began with terror but aimed at something broader, possibly extorting money, setting up a criminal base, and expanding attacks into larger campaigns. Those competing explanations left questions that were never entirely settled. Was Muhammad primarily motivated by personal anger, or was he reaching toward a larger but half-formed vision of power through fear? Malvo's words years later suggested the second, but the custody conflict gave weight to the first. In either version, the randomness of the killings had achieved the same effect: a region held in paralysis, convinced it was under siege by ghosts with rifles. The legal complexities extended further because the crimes crossed boundaries. Shootings took place in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., making jurisdiction a constant challenge. Prosecutors chose which murders to pursue first, balancing the likelihood of conviction, the harshest potential sentences, and the emotional needs of victims' families. Trials in Virginia proceeded faster, partly because the state was known for efficient capital sentencing. Later, Maryland and federal cases followed. Families of victims in different states sometimes waited years for their moments in court. Each new trial required revisiting painful details of sudden deaths, stretching their grief across a decade of legal process. While criminal trials addressed responsibility, another path emerged through civil court. Families of the dead and wounded filed lawsuits against Bushmaster, the manufacturer of the rifle, and Bullseye Shooter Supply, the gun dealer in Washington state, where the weapon had been obtained. The dealer had previously lost track of dozens of firearms through poor record-keeping, including the Bushmaster used in the attacks. Plaintiffs argued that both the company and the dealer should pay damages for allowing a military-grade weapon to slip into circulation without proper safeguards. After years of legal proceedings, a settlement was reached where both the manufacturer and the store agreed to pay compensation to the families. It was rare at the time a gunmaker held partly responsible in a civil suit for the outcomes of a crime. For many, that case reflected broader questions of how weapons flowed so easily into the hands of those who used them for mass violence. Beyond lawsuits and verdicts, officials examined how the case had been handled across multiple agencies. The attacks had forced local police, state troopers, and federal agents to share information rapidly, something not always common before 2002. Daily briefings became the norm. Joint command posts operated across jurisdictional boundaries, and data was exchanged more directly between departments. Though the case had stretched investigators to breaking points, it also highlighted the importance of cooperation. Lessons drawn from the sniper period informed later approaches to multi-jurisdictional crimes, especially incidents that might cross state lines within hours. Victims' families had their own version of aftermath, one filled with much slower resolutions. For some, courtrooms years after the shootings reopened trauma. For others, the guilty sentences brought at least a public acknowledgement, even if no punishment restored their loved ones. Memorial events and community gatherings helped provide space for shared memory. Yet many admitted that the randomness of the killings made closure harder to find. Losing someone while they pumped gas or walked across a lot felt too sudden to process even years later. For the broader public, The Beltway sniper trials became a marker of how quickly life could be destabilized by fear. The courtroom images of Muhammad and Malvo sitting beside defense lawyers contrasted with the terror they had stirred for 3 weeks. It became clear that casting fear across a region did not require armies or bombs. 2 people, a rifle, and a car had brought one of the most powerful cities in the world to a crawl. The lesson repeated by community leaders and news outlets was that terror can spread as fast as the bullets themselves, and that society's response must come from many directions: law enforcement, the courts, and even civil accountability when systems fail. That larger message endured beyond the verdicts. The trials settled personal accountability, but the cultural echoes asked how to prevent ordinary life from being so easily weaponized again. The laws, the lawsuits, the manpower, and the cooperation all pointed to the same answer. Resilience was possible, but only if every level of authority learned from the failures and the fear of 2002. From here, the story moves further away from the courtroom and into memory. Communities across Maryland and Virginia would carry the reminders far longer than the trials lasted. Memorials and markers emerged, small but permanent symbols that a time of dread had passed but was never forgotten. Documentaries, articles, and true crime studies kept the case present in public discussion. Even 2 decades later, the Sniper Weeks continued to appear in lessons about crisis response and community recovery, and with those echoes came the lasting reflection of how ordinary routines once became dangerous and how quickly safety could be shaken across an entire region. 2 decades later, the Beltway sniper attacks still sit in the memory of the Washington, D.C. area. For people who lived through the autumn of 2002, the sound of a single gunshot from nowhere is not just a detail in a headline. It lingers as a moment when life changed. Ordinary neighborhoods that once felt safe became linked in the public mind to fear. Even today, survivors, families, and communities point to those weeks as a period that reshaped how people thought about safety in their own backyards. One physical reminder stands in Wheaton, Maryland, where the first victim was killed. Reflection Terrace is a quiet spot, built as a place to remember those who died. The space was designed to provide somewhere for families and residents to visit, to put a marker on what had once been a random parking lot, transformed by violence. Simple but deliberate, the site acknowledges that the story of the sniper attacks can never be completely separated from the area's public spaces. The memorial is not simply about one man shot while leaving a store, but also about the way daily routines became bound up in fear. Another memorial stands in Rockville, honoring the victims across the region. Unlike Reflection Terrace, which sits directly where a killing occurred, the Rockville Memorial serves as a collective gathering site. Communities across Maryland and Virginia use it to come together and remember. People who were not even living in the area at the time visit, sometimes guided by documentaries or educational programs that re-examine the events with the benefit of hindsight. For families of victims, it is a place where names are not lost to statistics. Each one is recognized in stone and memory. These memorials are part of a larger effort to ensure that the attacks remain understood, not forgotten. Over the years, the story has been retold in films, podcasts, and news specials that revisit both the killings and the capture of John Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. Each retelling serves a slightly different purpose. Some emphasize the human side, giving voice to survivors and loved ones. Others study the law enforcement challenges and the slow process of building an investigation across multiple states. Still others focus on how the pair's relationship unfolded, drawing attention to the dynamic between a middle-aged man and a teenage boy. The case found its way into documentaries on major networks, placing the sniper period alongside other notorious crimes in American history. Podcasts often use the story to examine how communities react when normal life itself becomes risky. Films dramatize it, telling the story cinematically for audiences who may not have lived through those days. Collectively, this body of work ensures that while memories may fade in daily conversation, the sniper period remains active in cultural record. People who were not yet born in 2002 can still learn what DC residents experienced through those media. Beyond the memorials and broadcasts, the sniper attacks also shaped how officials planned for crises. One of the lessons learned was how random violence, when stretched over weeks, can change the behavior of an entire city. Law enforcement agencies used the case as an example of where coordination worked and where it faltered. Afterward, regional task forces for crimes that might span cities or counties became more common. Training on how to share intelligence quickly across state lines picked up momentum. In that way, the killings indirectly altered protocols far beyond DC, influencing how police around the nation prepared for mobile or hidden threats. There was also a recognition of how fear itself could act like a weapon. Students kept indoors, drivers crouched at gas stations, and businesses struggled as people avoided public spaces. Safety was not only about stopping bullets, but about maintaining social stability. Policymakers took note of how officials spoke to the public during the attacks, how press briefings soothed or inflamed anxiety, and how information sometimes spread confusion rather than guidance. These crisis communication lessons became part of the planning for later emergencies, teaching leaders about the power of clear messaging. Looking back, people often ask whether such a case could unfold again today. With modern surveillance cameras on streets and in parking lots, would a car like the blue Chevrolet Caprice be able to operate unnoticed for weeks? With digital trails, license plate readers, and faster information sharing, many argue that the shooters might be identified more quickly. But the underlying question remains troubling. Could ordinary routines still be weaponized by someone using distance, patience, and anonymity? Technology helps, but the basic vulnerability of people standing exposed while doing daily chores has not changed. That question keeps the sniper story relevant. It serves as a warning about complacency. The attacks showed how quickly normal space can turn threatening, under the hand of a determined couple of individuals with limited resources but high levels of planning. They did not need an elaborate network or sophisticated tools beyond a rifle, a car, and time. This realization continues to push discussions about community security, gun laws, and what it takes to keep people safe when danger might come not from organized terror groups, but from individuals working quietly. Yet the memory is not only about fear. Reflection Terrace and the Rockville Memorial embody resilience. Communities came together after the shootings to honor the dead and support each other. Residents who once crouched at gas stations eventually returned to ordinary routines, proof that fear, however intense, could not last forever. Families of victims have spoken of carrying grief, but also of seeing their neighborhoods take steps to remember their loved ones. Students who missed recess for weeks in 2002 grew into adults who now share their stories so those younger today understand what it felt like. Through documentaries, commemorative sites, and personal testimonies, the DC area continues to weave the sniper period into its collective identity. It is not remembered only as a time of violence, but as a test of endurance. Communities faced days where nothing felt predictable, yet still managed to return to normalcy once the danger ended. That shift from paralyzing fear back to daily function is itself a story of resilience. The Beltway sniper attacks remain a reminder that safety, so often taken for granted, can be shattered in a single moment. The memory shows both what can be lost in an instant and what can be rebuilt afterward. From names carved into stone to protocols written into training manuals, the impact lingers. And as long as that memory remains, it carries lessons about both vulnerability and strength. The reflection that lasts is simple. What happened in October of 2002 proved how quickly the ordinary could become lethal. And it also showed that even after weeks of fear, people could return to daily routines again. Safety can disappear in a matter of seconds, but communities can still hold together and rebuild once the fear is gone.